Well, thank you. I love that montage. I'm a bit of a thrill seeker, and so I took up driving in Delhi, and it never disappointed. Thank you so much to the organizers of the Camden Conference for inviting me to speak here. It's such an honor. And I want to thank everyone listening to this talk today for your interest in journalism in India and the very powerful counter-narratism pushed by the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. As the fastest growing large economy in the world, India is on the rise. So too are its geopolitical fortunes. Countries like the United States, Britain, Israel, and Russia are all vying for better access to its market, touted as an alternative to China for investments in manufacturing. At the same time, they court its diplomats for support. Here you see President Biden toasting Prime Minister Modi at a state dinner last June. Of course, this rise began long before Mr. Modi took the helm in New Delhi in 2014, but India's growing stature in the world under Mr. Modi has a bearing on how journalism and democracy are practiced. India's new strategic position means that the government has been largely absolved for a disturbing pattern of human rights abuses that have targeted the large minority Muslim population, as we've heard this morning. And it has been given a pass on its increasingly brazen crackdown on journalists and advocates of free speech, transparency, and accountability. To be clear, journalism is under threat in India. But I want to start this talk by acknowledging that the media landscape is still very vibrant, thanks to the daring of its reporters and editors and the dedication of its readers, listeners, and viewers. Journalists still play a vital function in Indian democracy, but the conditions in which they do their jobs are less and less free and more dangerous. At the same time, Mr. Modi's government and the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, is using all the communication channels at its disposal, from popular TV networks to WhatsApp groups, to dominate the political discourse in India and in the diaspora. And the semi-mechanized propaganda that has the power to corral votes and incite violence becomes even more treacherous in the new era of AI. Every institution in this large, bustling, chaotic, incredible nation, not just the media, is challenged. Mr. Modi is centralizing power in the Prime Minister's office in New Delhi. He and the Hindu right are deeply invested in how this historical moment is portrayed and understood, both within and outside of India, and that comes down to control. It is now broadly understood, both among high-level bureaucrats and humble shopkeepers, that anyone pushing back against this campaign of control could face real and dire consequences. Mr. Modi rather famously rarely gives interviews or press conferences. He has no need. So it was a bit of a coup for the Financial Times to sit down with him recently. The tenor of what he said in the parts of the interview published by the FT expressed the confidence of a politician poised to win re-election and a head of state fated by world leaders and business tycoons. But when the journalist asked him about a crackdown on critics in India, he responded with a, quote, long and hearty laugh. A strange response in a context where journalists are jailed, newsrooms are raided, NGOs are cut off from funding, and a slate of legislation is being passed that is designed to curtail speech. All of that said, I hope to leave you today with a sense of hope. India's story, after all, is still very much being written. Allow me to give a quick overview of the news landscape in India. India is a nation of superlatives, and that's true of its news market, the largest in the world. From 2021 to 2022, the combined circulation of all daily newspapers was more than 225 million copies, according to the government. More than 225 million newspapers printed, distributed, and read every day. It's a newswoman's dream in many ways. And every weekday afternoon during my 4.5 years working in Delhi, I'd take a walk around Connaught Place, which is home to many of the city's newsrooms, and see people thumbing through newspapers. Office drones, students, rickshaw pullers, it's a wonderful sight. In 2012, Ken Auletta wrote in The New Yorker that, quote, "India is one of the few places on earth where newspapers still thrive." A dozen years later, that's still very true. The daily circulation of newspapers has doubled since 2012. The Trade Association WARC estimates that about half of urban India reads a newspaper every day. There are also hundreds of TV news channels, many of them highly influential and highly partisan. Cheap to produce shouting matches dominate, like they do here. Republic TV, something akin to India's Fox News, is unapologetically pro-government, and that used to set it apart. No longer. Both TV and newspapers derive a huge share of their advertising income from the government, especially since the pandemic, when other ad buyers withdrew. NDTV, the last bastion of independent TV news, was acquired by one of the world's richest men, energy tycoon Gautam Adani, seen here in Ahmedabad. The fortunes of Mr. Adani have risen alongside Mr. Modi's. Adani won NDTV in a hostile takeover bid in 2022, and since then, many of the network's longtime anchors and executives have stepped down. But increasingly, the biggest scoops, the gutsiest investigations, and the best watchdog reporting are appearing not in newspapers or TV, but in the digital pages of scrappy online news startups. Much of this work is supported by grants and reader subscriptions and donations, and the journalists doing this work are particularly targeted by the government and its supporters. Back in 2012, internet use was limited. Now, roughly half of this country of 1.4 billion is online, according to the Reuters Institute at Oxford. Indians use more smartphone data than the US and China combined. The media landscape online is exploding as a result. Again, according to Reuters, more than half of respondents said they got their news on YouTube and WhatsApp. It's a bit of a problem because WhatsApp and other digital communication platforms are very efficient at feeding misinformation, whipping up nationalist fervor, and organizing hate. There has been such a high incidence of violence attributed to India's most popular chat platform that researchers coined the term, quote, WhatsApp lynchings. This picture by my friend, the late photographer Danish Siddiqui of Reuters, shows a group of Hindu men beating a Muslim man during sectarian violence in Delhi in 2020. This is a riot that broke out over the Citizenship Act that was spoken about this morning. I alluded at the beginning of this talk to what good journalism is up against in India, and part of it is this: misinformation that bombards Indians through apps on their phones. Also, the Modi government uses its heft as a large ad buyer to muzzle the mainstream press, and it uses legal warfare to discredit, censor, and silence the journalists who dare to present a reality that is contrary to the one the BJP and its supporters have invested so much to project. Mr. Modi's PR machine is a thing to behold. The Prime Minister has become larger than life, standing tall in towering billboards across the capital, speaking in weekly radio addresses, and traveling around the country for ceremonial groundbreakings on projects that concretize a Hindu nationalist vision. His governance style is constant campaign mode. Modi's image is ubiquitous, but also carefully curated. The state-run and other co-opted media often depict Mr. Modi standing alone, a sober, almost ethereal, godlike figure. And to his supporters, criticism of him or his government's policies, which his party conflates into being one and the same, has become a kind of blasphemy. The untold sums the government and the BJP and its supporters are spending on publicity appear to be a very sound investment, because more and more of the country is falling in line. Recent evidence of this is the inauguration of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya. Again, this is a Hindu temple that was built on the rubble of a 450-year-old mosque that was torn down by Hindu nationalist activists in 1992. It was an act of terrorism that left 2,000 dead, a dark day for India. Not so in the new India of Mr. Modi and his supporters, whose revisionist take on history is literally taking form brick by brick. Seizing the site and building a temple to the Hindu god Ram, who Hindus believe was born in Ayodhya, has been a cornerstone of the Hindu nationalist project for decades. But what seemed an outrageous and fringe idea in the 1990s has become a pillar of a popular prime minister's re-election campaign this year. The temple's inauguration in January had all the pomp and circumstance of a national holiday. Even the Delhi government, which is run by the opposition Aap Party, jumped on the bandwagon, ordering a half day at school so that teachers could watch the prime minister at the partially built temple in wall-to-wall cable TV news coverage. My colleagues Mujib Mashal and Hari Kumar were there in Ayodhya, and they reported, quote, "As a show of laser lights and bone-jarring beats went on in the background, about a dozen national television channels tried to outdo each other in what for most has become a guiding mission, to shine a favorable spotlight on the prime minister's every move." So deeply enthralled is the popular press to Mr. Modi that the government's setbacks, from Chinese troop incursions across India's border to an economy that has failed to produce enough jobs for young people, especially women, to an ethnic conflict brewing in the Northeast, receive on the whole far less attention. This is a picture of Indian soldiers in eastern Ladakh, a region high in the Himalaya, where 20 Indian soldiers were killed in a clash with Chinese troops in 2020. In the recent interview with the FT, Mr. Modi spoke about the work of changing perceptions. He was addressing a question about corruption, but I think we can read his answer more broadly. He said, quote, "It's important to recognize that India wouldn't have achieved the status of the world's fastest growing economy if the issues you've highlighted were as pervasive as suggested. Often," he said, "these concerns stem from perceptions, and altering perceptions sometimes takes time." Altering public perceptions for the Modi government has involved more than just projecting the prime minister's image everywhere. It has also involved punishing critics who question his dogma. Indian journalists have endured raids, harassment, arrests, and imprisonment. The government has spied on them using Pegasus, and it has charged them with the highest crimes in India, offending religious sentiment, sedition, and even terrorism, simply for toiling away as reporters. Thousands of people have been detained in India under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, including poets, political organizers, and even an elderly Catholic priest with Parkinson's disease who died in custody. The UAPA has also been used against journalists. There are 13 journalists currently who are being tried or investigated, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. One of them is Siddique Kappan, a reporter from Kerala who was arrested on his way to the scene of an alleged gang rape of a teenage Dalit girl in the state of Uttar Pradesh. The girl later died of her injuries. Mr. Kappan was traveling to the city of Hathras when he was stopped at a toll plaza. He and his taxi driver were taken into custody by the Uttar Pradesh police. The top official in Uttar Pradesh, for those who don't know, is a Hindu priest and powerful BJP leader. For merely intending to report on the gruesome sexual assault of a Dalit girl by Hindu men, Mr. Kappan was charged with sedition, promoting enmity among religious groups, and UAPA. Here he is 2.5 years later, with his family after he was released from prison. Unsatisfied, apparently, with the criminal law procedures the government has at its disposal to threaten, intimidate, and silence journalists, the government has introduced rules to better harness what's published online. The so-called IT rules have created a government fact-checking unit whose purpose is to identify, quote-unquote, fake, false, or misleading information concerning the government. Once identified, the platforms hosting this information are ordered to edit or take it down. This happened recently with the noted investigative magazine The Caravan, which was forced to take down a story in which the Indian Army was accused of torturing 3 men who died in custody in Kashmir. The government has also weaponized its tax authorities to go after journalists, think tanks and advocacy groups who represent a threat in some fashion to the narrative that Mr. Modi and his supporters want conveyed about India. The targets have ranged from Amnesty International to Greenpeace to India's Center for Policy Research, a premier think tank in Delhi. In a testament to the independence of online news organizations and the threat that independence poses to the government, reporters and editors have had their privacy invaded in myriad ways. Last October, the police in New Delhi, the law enforcement arm of the central government, raided the homes and offices of journalists who worked for a left-leaning portal called NewsClick. Several journalists were arrested and their laptops, phones, and cameras were seized. It was the newsroom's second government raid in 2 years. The first was done by financial authorities in 2021. Here, you'll see authorities carrying out seized items from the raid. And around this time last year, tax authorities raided the offices of the BBC, just a few weeks after the release of a documentary that took a critical look at Mr. Modi's role in the deadly Gujarat riots of 2002, when he was the state's chief minister. The government also used the occasion to flex its new IT rules, forcing YouTube and Twitter, now X, to take down links to the documentary. I mentioned earlier that Hindu nationalists have used social media channels to organize hate, distrust, and even violence against Muslims, and I want to speak more about that now. Professor Varshni, who we were fortunate to hear speak earlier today, has argued eloquently that India is in the process of creating its own Jim Crow system, with Muslims denigrated into second-class citizens. The Ram Temple is a consecration of this new Hindu supremacist order, Mr. Varshni and others argue. It is clear that among the journalists facing persecution by the Modi government and his allies, Muslim journalists are most directly in the crosshairs, and I will give you just a few examples of that. Of the 13 journalists I mentioned who are facing charges under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, 9 are Muslim. In Kashmir, India's only Muslim-majority region, the entire population was plunged into a communications blackout in 2019, as lawmakers in Delhi, led by the BJP, voted to take away the region's statehood and right to self-governance. Before and since, Kashmiri reporters routinely spoke about being brought in for interrogations and jailed. The Kashmir Press Club, seen here, was forcibly taken over and shut down in 2022. Across India, Muslim women journalists have found themselves listed for sale on an auctions app. I won't give the name of the app here because it includes a vulgar, derogatory term for a Muslim woman combined with the Hindi word for female servant. The more than 20 women whose personal information was shared in this fake auction had all reported critically on how the Modi government's policies had impacted religious minorities. They were mostly women in their early 20s, working for the hard-hitting new online journalism outlets that have proven so difficult to muzzle or control. Finally, I'm going to speak a bit about my experience as a journalist in India, which was a great privilege. First for the Associated Press and then the New York Times, I enjoyed many rights that my Indian colleagues at local news outlets do not. But the climate in India has become so antagonistic toward the free press that even those of us in the Foreign Press Corps found ourselves the targets of harassment and sometimes far worse. A French journalist, Vanessa Dugnac, who had been living in and reporting from India for decades, had to leave the country recently after the government told her that she could have her visa withdrawn or face harsher penalties for practicing journalism. An internal survey that I and others conducted over 3 years at the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia found that 1 of every 2 foreign correspondents is summoned by the Modi government to explain their reporting. I was summoned at least twice a year. A badge of honor? Usually the summons came disguised as a friendly invitation to tea. But just as soon as the tea had been poured, one minister or another would start berating us. One time, I remember the Minister of Information going to the trouble of printing the last 15 or 20 of my and other correspondents' articles. He then read headlines aloud, seemingly at random, with some sarcasm in his tone. It almost wasn't worth the tea. Beyond the reprimands, the government punishes those whose stories it doesn't like with short-term visas that make renting an apartment or even buying a cell phone service all but impossible. Nearly a third of the subcontinent is now off limits to foreign journalists without a special permit, a permit that almost never comes. No journalist has been permitted to report from Kashmir since the drastic political changes of 2019. Despite all that I've spoken about today, I want to end with optimism. Young Indians, especially young women, are clamoring to get into journalism. The universe of journalism schools is growing constantly in India, and Indians comprise the largest share of foreign students at many journalism schools in the US, including my alma mater, Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Even with the long hours and terrible pay in most Indian newsrooms, even with the high barriers to entry in Western news organizations, where old hierarchies are proving slow to dismantle. Even with the real threat of false charges, arrest, doxing, harassment, physical violence, and financial ruin. They have Arundhati Roy on their side. The novelist is also facing charges for speech that the Indian authorities didn't like. We all have reason to hope that things will change in India, a place of infinite potential whose fate is very much tied to all of our own. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. I appreciate this. Did the framers of the Indian Constitution, do you know much about this? Did they think about something First Amendment-like? Is freedom of the press at some level enshrined in the Constitution?
Freedom of expression is enshrined in the Constitution. And I'm no constitutional scholar, but so I'd have to defer to my colleagues here. But
sure.
I think they very much did. And in fact, the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, founded a newspaper himself and believed very openly and vociferously in the place of the press, both for a country that aspired to greater education and literacy and as an important check against political powers in the country.
Just a couple of details before we actually get to audience questions. Help me from earlier in your presentation about the pressure that the government can exert indirectly through buying up advertising in news publications. What's that mechanism so I understand it better?
Well, I mean, it's a simple commercial pressure. So particularly in the pandemic, when many companies, were looking at their ad spending and deciding to spend less, the government was able to spend more. And many newspapers in the country and many cable TV news stations depend on their existence at this point on government ad spending. If the government were to suddenly turn off the tap, they would go under. So it's really that simple.
And you used one word I think it'd be worth people settling on for just a second. You talked about official spying on journalists through something called Pegasus.
Right.
What is that?
Well, it is spy software that was developed by a company in Israel. And we have learned in recent years that different governments across the world have purchased the software and used it to track their own citizens.
Yeah, you may have seen Google researchers put out a very concerned report about not just Pegasus, but a raft of companies around the world that provide the ability of authorities and others to hack into your phones. And there's anticipated talk of legislation in the US allied with other countries on this, but it hasn't gone that far yet. So an aside here. Let's get some questions going. I have a million, but I'm in this business, so let me let you participate. Is there a question here? Tell us your name. If there is a question there. Yeah, I think there is.
Hi, my name is Deanna Martin, and I'm with Maine SPIA. I know you spoke a little bit during your time about the silencing of journalists speaking out against incidences of sexual assault in India. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what additional obstacles this silencing creates in the seeking of justice for survivors and the prevention of violence against women. Thank you so much.
That's a great question, and a complicated one, I think. But I spoke about a specific case, and again, just to kind of reiterate the social context in which this particular case happened. This was a girl from the lowest caste, the Dalit caste, in a state, Uttar Pradesh, which is controlled by a Hindu priest who commands not only a lot of respect among sort of religious people, but is a very powerful BJP leader in his own right. That's the party, that's Modi's party. And so for a girl of this standing to allege something as serious as a sexual assault committed by upper caste people who are among Hindus, but higher order than she, at any time, I think, in India's history, this would be a fraught accusation. But now, the point I was trying to make is this government and the ruling party are so invested in a narrative of, tranquility, communal harmony, despite plenty of evidence to the contrary, that they did not allow this reporter to even reach the scene. Of course, the story got out anyway, and some of the news outlets I was talking about online, places like The Wire, News Laundry, carried this story extensively. So there wasn't, the government had no ability really to contain it. But a point was made, I think, in that arrest, that this kind of reporting won't be tolerated. And the implications for the alleged victim and for other women and men who are victims of sexual violence, I think, is pretty clear. That if there is, such consequence for somebody daring to report on the allegations, perhaps they shouldn't be made at all. So I think they're pretty serious. And in a country where, just like the rest of the world, sexual violence is seriously underreported, this is yet another obstacle.
Question over here.
Hi, Andy from Old Orchard again. Emily, great reporting. I have a two-part question. One on Adani. Over the last year, from February of 23 to today, he personally has lost about $100 billion because of different things going on. Has that reduced his respect within the Indian community? And secondly, how do you compare what's going on with India? Because the way you're describing it, it really sounds like Putin's Russia right now. So could you compare and contrast?
Oh, wow.
You were drawing a distinction between, when sketching out the media landscape, that still it thrives at a much higher level than, say, Russia.
Yeah, I would certainly argue that that's the case. I think there are, strands of authoritarianism that naturally draw comparison, but no, I don't think, from my vantage point, that there is there's a true comparison between India and Russia still. And on your question about Adani, I mean, I think the speculation in the stock market and the question about kind of the fundamentals in his business that have affected share prices and have caused him to lose a lot of money on paper have dented his credibility somewhat. I think more people are questioning, looking at his role critically and looking at his relationship with the regime in Delhi more critically. But at the end of the day, there's so much boosterism in the Indian economy, and he is, a major player. So I don't think it's dented his credibility so much that he's not going to continue to thrive and make billions of dollars from his enterprises, which are extensive and really kind of at the heart of the energy system in India, which everyone acknowledges is, kind of India needs even more of to continue to aspire economically to this, coveted top 3 in the world position it wants to reach.
And I think it's the story of Mr. Adani that you raised in his acquisition was NTV, you said?
NDTV.
NDTV, that's right, is an invitation to reflect on that mechanism in the United States. Some people in this room may think it's A-OK about Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post, which seems to have remained a vigorous newspaper under his watch. But you have deep-pocketed individuals buying up struggling media across the country who may be imposing different types of ideology on the newsrooms. And it's a struggle in this country as well. Let's go to the balcony. Tell us your name.
My name is Brennan, and I go to Edward Little in Auburn, Maine. I know I've read a bunch of your articles about Me Too and repression in India, and I was wondering, do you feel that India or America is leading in the right direction for women?
Does it have to be either or? I'm not sure either country is doing great on the measure of, leading on women. I think there have been some serious setbacks in both countries. That said, I think India, and credit must go in part to the Modi government, is including more and more women in the economic growth that it's experiencing. But there are a lot of sort of historic and social obstacles to women really taking advantage as they could in a country like India, even though girls are increasingly what they call toppers in India. They earn the highest scores. There's still not equity in the best jobs. Most jobs and most public-facing jobs in India still go to men, and it's different regionally. In the south, in cities like Bangalore, Hyderabad, elsewhere, there are many more women in corporate jobs. Conversely, in the north, where there are fewer corporate jobs and more traditional kind of village family structures, women are really having a hard time, girls and women are really having a hard time in obtaining the jobs, despite the fact that they are excellent in every way. And then, I'm not going to get into the issues that American women are grappling with here, but I think both countries, I think it speaks to what the previous speakers this morning addressed on the question of kind of what is democracy and what is liberalism, and can one, democracy sort of impede the other.
Is there a question here? Oh, let's do number uno here.
I'm Matt from Camden, and I'm interested in more of the dynamics of when you would get called in for tea. Would like cultural factors, like they would say, you're an American, you don't understand India, and attack you in that way? And also whether meanwhile, off the record, any government officials or politicians would come up to you quietly and say, look, I know we overdo it, or something along those lines. Did you get any sympathy, in other words?
Yes and yes. I mean, I think, yeah, we would be called in, and some of it would be, look, you're American, you don't get it. India is a complex and ancient civilization, and you've just come here and you can't possibly hope to understand it. And I do think that India is incredibly complex, and it was the greatest challenge of my career so far, trying to interpret it. And I acknowledge fully that I remain an amateur. I would never consider myself expert, and that I'm a humble student of India, first and foremost. There's much, much more to learn, even after 4.5 years there, certainly. That said, we're in the facts business, so some of it was a matter of interpretation, some of it was simply reporting facts, and it felt performative often, that these summons, and then sometimes, yes, privately, after hours at the Foreign Correspondents Club, somebody might say, hey, look, sorry, we had to kind of make an example out of you, or we had to sort of bring you in that way. But on the whole, I would say there's increasingly an us versus them mentality, and a sense among the ruling party that they really don't need to engage with the foreign press. They're very interested in cultivating, kind of their image among the organs of media within India, but they don't need to speak to the outside world that way. And if they do, it will be through Mr. Modi himself in Washington. So I think we felt a bit of that. And also, I think simultaneously, there is, a broad kind of resistance and a bit of just frustration with the Western gaze on India, particularly from outlets like the one I work for and others who do have this long history of, evolution, very much that it hasn't always put us in the best light or put us in the best position to tell India's story, I think, with the proper amount of humility, for lack of a better word. So I think there's all of that going on. But that said, I think there's also a broader campaign to censor and control that now includes, foreign press in addition to domestic.
We should tell you that Emily's going to come back for another Q&A session a little bit later in the program, even separate from the final one, where all our panelists will be on stage. We have time for one question. I think it's from the balcony. Is it here?
Hi, I'm Autumn. I'm with the Watershed School. I was just wondering, this seems to share a lot of similarities with Indira Gandhi's emergency period. And so I was just wondering if there was a reason for this repetition of history, if there was any connections that you knew of?
Yeah, that's interesting that you draw that parallel. Indira Gandhi was prime minister under the Congress Party, and I think people have, made that comparison, but I think there are a lot of critical differences. In that period, a lot of rights were suspended and done so in a very sort of draconian manner, but also in a very public way. There was an acknowledgement that rules were not going to be, or sort of norms were not going to be adhered to in that period. So there was something that was explicitly temporary about it. Whereas now, I think, there's no declaration of emergency. This is just a sort of a slower and steadier degradation of rights that we're seeing. And so, but yes, in both cases, I think there are concerns that there's been an erosion of democracy and democratic principles.
And just before we go, you raised this idea of WhatsApp being a device to incite violence. Yet India's a country that has this IT law that you think could control that. It says a lot that the IT law is not being used, for instance, in that case when you're combating violence. It's clearly politicized, the IT law, as you try to point out.
That's right.
Emily Schmall, we welcome you back in just a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.